The summer of 1859 pressed down upon the plantation like a suffocating hand, thick with the scent of cane and rot, and in that heavy air a judgment was passed that would stain the soil deeper than blood ever could. He was 20 years old when his father stood before the gathered men and women and declared him unfit for reproduction. The word unfit echoed across the yard as though it were a sentence pronounced by God himself, yet there was no mercy in it, only calculation. The father's face remained carved from stone, his pale eyes fixed not on his son but on the broad-shouldered enslaved woman standing several paces away, her wrists bound loosely as if restraint were only symbolic. She was known across the land for her strength, for hauling loads that broke other backs, for surviving fevers that carried others into shallow graves. The son felt every gaze like a brand against his skin. He had always sensed something unfinished about himself in his father's eyes, as though he were livestock that failed to meet a breeding standard. Yet he had not expected this public stripping of dignity, this cold transaction made not in whispers but in daylight. The declaration carried a peculiar cruelty, unfit not for work, not for loyalty, but for reproduction, as if his bloodline were a crop deemed diseased. The woman lifted her head only once during the pronouncement. Her gaze met his briefly, and in it there was no pity. There was something older. Something watchful. His father approached her with deliberate steps and placed a firm hand on her shoulder, testing the strength beneath her skin as though evaluating an animal at market. "She will take him," he said simply. No explanation followed. No justification. The gathered overseers shifted uneasily, sensing a boundary had been crossed but unwilling to question it. Orders were orders. That night, the son was led to the far quarters near the edge of the cane fields, where the wind carried strange murmurs after dark. He noticed how the other enslaved workers avoided looking at him as he passed, their silence thicker than the humid air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl and did not stop for several long minutes. Inside the small cabin, shadows clung to the corners as though they belonged there. The woman stood waiting, unbound now, her posture calm and unafraid. When the door closed behind him, sealing them in, he understood that whatever his father intended was not merely humiliation. It was ritual. And as the first whisper of wind slid through the cracks in the wood, carrying a voice too low to be human, he realized with a growing chill that he had not been given to her as punishment alone, but as an offering to something that had been waiting long before either of them were born. In the suffocating heat of 1859, beneath a sky bleached pale by an unforgiving sun, the judgment was spoken aloud as if it were a matter of livestock rather than blood. The plantation yard stood silent except for the low rustle of cane fields bending in the distant wind. He had been summoned without explanation, dragged from the dim coolness of the main house into the open where overseers lingered and enslaved workers paused in cautious stillness. His father stood at the center, posture rigid, gloved hands clasped behind his back like a magistrate about to pass sentence. There was no tremor in his voice when he declared his own son unfit for reproduction. The words fell with clinical precision, neither shouted nor whispered, but measured, deliberate enough that everyone would hear, remember, and understand. The son felt the earth tilt beneath him. He had endured criticism before, harsh lessons, cold evaluations, comparisons to stronger men, but this accusation carried something darker. Unfit suggested defect. It implied corruption in the blood. His father's gaze did not linger on him long. Instead, it shifted toward the edge of the gathering where a woman stood, tall and broad-shouldered, her presence commanding even in enforced stillness. She was known throughout the land not only for her physical strength but for her resilience. She had survived punishments that left others crippled. She had outworked men twice her size. Her endurance had become legend whispered between cabins at night. Without ceremony, the father gestured toward her. "She will take him," he announced, as though assigning property to property. A murmur rippled through the yard before dying instantly under the overseer's glare. No one dared question him. The father approached the woman slowly, circling her with the detached interest of a breeder examining stock. His gloved fingers pressed against her shoulder, testing muscle beneath skin. She did not flinch. Her eyes, dark and steady, remained fixed forward until they briefly met the sun's. In that fleeting exchange, he saw something that unsettled him more than humiliation, recognition. Not of him, but of the moment itself, as if she had seen it unfold before in other forms. The sun wanted to protest, to demand explanation, but years of conditioning sealed his lips. His father believed lineage was sacred, a line that must remain pure and powerful. To be labeled unfit meant he had failed some invisible standard, some silent expectation whispered into his father's ear by obsession. The accusation carried an implication that his weakness, whatever it was, could be corrected through an act both cruel and calculated. Yet beneath the practical tone of the announcement lurked something ritualistic, something older than plantation logic. As dusk bled into the sky, he was escorted toward the far edge of the property where the air felt heavier. The enslaved quarters there were older, the wood warped and darkened with age. The cane fields beyond seemed to whisper in restless waves, their sharp leaves scraping together like hushed voices conspiring. The workers avoided his eyes as he passed. Fear traveled through them like a current, though whether it was fear for him or of him, he could not tell. Inside the small cabin prepared for them, shadows pooled unnaturally thick along the walls. A single lantern burned low, its flame flickering despite the absence of wind. The woman entered without chains this time, her wrists free, her posture composed. She closed the door behind them with deliberate care. The sound of the latch sliding into place felt final, like the ceiling of a vault. He turned toward her, anger and shame warring inside him. Why? He demanded, though he was not certain whether he was asking her or the universe itself. She regarded him in silence for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was steady, textured with something that felt ancient. "Because your father believes strength can be forced into blood," she said. "He believes what is broken can be remade." Her words unsettled him. "And you accept this?" A faint smile touched her lips, though it carried no warmth. "Accept," she echoed. "No one here accepts anything. We endure." Outside, the wind rose suddenly, pressing against the cabin walls with a low, moaning force. The lantern flame stretched thin and nearly extinguished. He felt a chill creep along his spine despite the oppressive heat. The air inside the cabin seemed charged, alive with something unseen. "What does he expect to prove?" he whispered. She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming not because of aggression but because of certainty. "He expects to create something stronger than himself," she said. "But men like him do not understand that blood remembers." The phrase lodged in his mind. Blood remembers. He thought of the stories he had overheard as a child, tales of previous generations who had disappeared from the plantation records without explanation, of experiments whispered about in drunken fragments. His father's obsession with legacy had always bordered on madness. Now, standing in that dim cabin, he sensed that this arrangement was not born solely from cruelty or humiliation. It was an offering disguised as correction. A distant howl rose from the fields, long and mournful. The woman's gaze shifted briefly toward the sound, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in her expression, not fear, but awareness. As if the land itself were listening. He realized then that being declared unfit was not the true sentence. The true sentence was being chosen for whatever came next. His father had not cast him aside, he had placed him precisely where he believed transformation would occur. Whether that transformation meant redemption or ruin remained unspoken. The cabin seemed to breathe around them, wood creaking softly as though adjusting to their presence. The woman reached out and pressed her palm against the center of his chest. Her hand was warm, steady, grounding. "Whatever he believes he controls," she murmured, "he does not." The wind outside intensified, rattling the shutters. Somewhere deep within the fields, something moved against the natural rhythm of the night. He felt it then, a subtle tremor beneath his ribs, not fear, not anger, but something awakening, as if the declaration spoken in daylight had stirred a dormant current within his veins, and as the lantern's flame guttered lower, he understood that the experiment had already begun long before the cabin door had closed, long before his father's voice had pronounced him unfit, and long before he had ever questioned the strange weight that had followed him since birth. The discovery did not come all at once. It began as a pattern too faint to name, a thin crack in the surface of what he had been told was truth. In the weeks following his father's decree, the plantation seemed to watch him differently. Conversation stopped when he approached. Overseers exchanged glances that were not mocking, but wary. The strongest enslaved woman, who now moved through the quarters with the same measured calm, studied him in silence, as though measuring not his body but his mind. It was in the main house library, a room his father rarely permitted him to enter alone, that the first thread revealed itself. The afternoon had been suffocating, the air unmoving and thick with dust. His father had ridden out to inspect neighboring land, leaving the house unnaturally quiet. Drawn by a restless instinct he could not explain, he stepped into the library and shut the door softly behind him. The room smelled of leather and decay. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, journals, and genealogical records his father guarded obsessively. On the central desk lay a heavy book bound in cracked brown leather. Its spine bore no title. Something about its placement felt deliberate, almost inviting. He opened it carefully. The first pages were filled with dates, births, pairings, outcomes. The language was clinical, detached. He read of unions arranged between enslaved women and selected men, not for affection or even labor efficiency, but for traits, endurance, bone structure, resistance to illness. The tone was not unlike his father's voice in the yard that day. It was the language of breeding. Then he saw the names. His own family name appeared repeatedly, generation after generation, always beside the same notations: deficiency observed, instability, correction attempted. His pulse quickened as he turned pages faster. The dates stretched back decades. Nearly every 20 years, there was an entry describing a son deemed inadequate in some undefined but ominous way. Each time, the son had been paired with a woman described only by physical attributes: height, musculature, stamina. He traced one entry with trembling fingers. 1819, subject exhibited frailty of will. Paired under ritual conditions. Result inconclusive. Subject deteriorated within months. Another. 1839, subject compliant but susceptible to delusion. Pairing initiated. Offspring non-viable. Subject confined following signs of madness. Madness. The word seemed to swell on the page, distorting the ink. He flipped forward to 1859. His own year. His own initials written in his father's precise hand. Subject resistant to instruction. Weakness suspected in temperament. Pairing enacted. Observation ongoing. Observation ongoing. He staggered back from the desk as though the book itself had struck him. The room felt smaller, the air thinner. This was no impulsive humiliation. It was a continuation. A ritual repeated with methodical patience. He was not the first son judged unfit. He was the latest. A faint scratching sound drew his attention to the far corner of the room. At first, he thought it was a rat behind the walls. But the sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic. 3 slow scrapes. A pause. 3 more. He swallowed and stepped closer to the shelf where the sound originated. Behind a row of ledgers, he found a narrow panel in the wall, slightly ajar. Inside was a hidden compartment containing several smaller journals, older and more fragile. The ink inside them had faded to a sickly brown. Unlike the ledger's detached tone, these were written in uneven, frantic script. He opened the first at random. I hear them in the fields at night, one entry read. They whisper of blood and soil. Father says it is weakness of mind. He says the pairing will strengthen me. But she looks at me as if she knows something I do not. His breath caught. The handwriting grew more erratic further down the page. They come in dreams. Not voices, memories. Men who look like me, but hollowed. They say the land keeps what it is given. He turned to another journal. This one described visions of figures standing among the cane, watching silently. Of livestock found drained of life without wound. Of waking with dirt beneath fingernails and no recollection of leaving the cabin. Each account ended the same way, fragmentation. Words trailing off mid-sentence. Ink smeared as though the writer's hand had trembled uncontrollably. None described survival. The implication settled into him with crushing weight. Generations before him had been subjected to this same ritual, declared defective, paired in the name of correction, and each had descended into something beyond mere madness. Their records ceased abruptly, their names quietly erased from family history. His father had not only known, he had documented it meticulously. The scratching sound returned, louder now. He froze. It was not coming from the wall anymore. It was coming from the floor beneath him. 3 slow scrapes. A pause. 3 more. His gaze dropped to the wooden boards at his feet. For a fleeting moment, he imagined something beneath the house, something buried and restless. The journal spoke of the land as though it were sentient, as though it demanded continuation of the ritual. A cold realization crept over him, perhaps the madness was not failure. Perhaps it was transformation. He thought of the woman waiting each night in the cabin by the fields. Of her steady gaze, her cryptic words about blood remembering. What if she knew of these previous sons? What if she had seen the pattern unfold more than once? The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low vibration that seemed to hum through the wood and into his bones. His vision blurred at the edges. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw shapes moving beyond the window, figures standing in the cane, too still to be workers, too numerous to be coincidence. He slammed the journal shut and shoved the hidden panel closed, but the knowledge could not be hidden again. The ritual was older than his father's obsession. It had roots sunk deep into the soil, fed by repetition. As he stepped out of the library into the fading light of evening, he felt the weight of unseen eyes following him. The plantation no longer felt like property. It felt like a vessel. A place designed to contain something cyclical and hungry. He was not merely participating in his father's experiment. He was walking a path worn down by men who had come before him, men who had read the same words, heard the same whispers, and felt the same tremor beneath their feet before losing themselves to whatever waited patiently within the fields, and as the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, he understood that the true horror was not that they had gone mad, but that every record suggested they had seen something real before they did. The revelation did not come as a confession, nor as a dramatic unveiling beneath thunder or flame. It arrived quietly, like a truth that had been waiting for him to grow still enough to hear it. For days after his discovery in the hidden journals, he watched her differently. The strongest enslaved woman moved through the quarters with deliberate calm, her presence commanding not through force but through gravity, as though the very air shifted to accommodate her. Others deferred to her in subtle ways, small nods, lowered gazes, a clearing of space when she passed. It was not fear alone. It was reverence. One night, when the wind dragged its fingers through the cane fields in restless strokes, he confronted her. "You knew," he said, standing inside the dim cabin where shadows clung thick to the corners. The lantern flame flickered between them. "About the others. The sons before me." She did not turn immediately. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, hands resting on her knees, posture upright. "Yes," she answered at last. The simplicity of her response unsettled him more than denial would have. "How?" His voice cracked despite his effort to steady it. "How could you know what my father hides even from his own blood?" She lifted her gaze to him then, and in her eyes he saw not submission, not bitterness, but something ancient and unyielding. Because this did not begin with your father, she said. Nor with his father before him. The cabin seemed to tighten around them as if the walls were listening. Outside, the insects had gone strangely silent. My mother was brought here in chains, she continued. But her mother was born on this land. And her mother before that. We have watched your family for generations. He felt the word settle like cold iron in his stomach. Watched us? Yes. She rose slowly, stepping closer until the lantern light caught the sharp lines of her face. You think this is your father's design? That he is the architect of this cruelty? He is only repeating something he does not fully understand. He shook his head. The journals. The journals record outcomes, she interrupted gently. Not origins. A tremor passed through the floorboards, subtle but unmistakable. He stiffened. She did not. This land was not empty when your ancestors claimed it, she said. It held memory long before fences. Long before ledgers. The soil remembers what is buried in it. Blood most of all. The phrase echoed what she had told him before. Blood remembers. But now it carried weight beyond metaphor. My lineage, she said, placing a hand against her chest, is tied to that memory. We are not merely labor here. We are bound. He stared at her, struggling to reconcile the image of chains and enforced toil with the authority in her voice. Bound how? She stepped past him and opened the cabin door. Cool night air spilled inside, heavy with the scent of damp earth. She gestured for him to follow. They walked into the cane fields, the stalks rising high on either side like walls. The moon hung pale and swollen above them. As they moved deeper, he became aware of a faint hum beneath the wind, a vibration that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. She stopped at a small clearing where the ground dipped slightly inward. The soil there was darker, almost black. Kneeling, she pressed her palm against it. Your ancestors came here desperate, she said quietly. The first of your line could not produce an heir. Crops failed. Livestock died without cause. He sought strength wherever he could find it. The wind stirred violently through the cane, though the sky remained clear. He made an agreement, she continued. Not with a man. Not with any living thing you could name easily. He offered blood from his own line in exchange for prosperity. Not death. Not sacrifice in the way you imagine. But union. A merging of weakness with something older. His throat tightened. That's madness. Yes, she agreed softly. It is. She stood and faced him fully. The women of my lineage were chosen not only for strength of body, but because we carry that older thread. We are the bridge. Every generation, when your family's blood thins, when instability shows itself, the ritual is repeated. Your father believes he is correcting flaws. He does not understand he is feeding a pact. The ground beneath his feet seemed suddenly unstable. And the sons, he asked, though he already feared the answer. They see too much, she said. The merging is not gentle. Some minds cannot hold what rises. They begin to hear the land clearly. They feel its hunger, its memory. It fractures them. He thought of the journals filled with frantic script, of references to whispers and figures in the fields. You're saying they weren't mad? Her gaze did not waver. Madness is a word men use when they cannot explain awakening. A distant shape moved at the edge of the clearing. He spun toward it, heart hammering, but the cane stood still once more. Why tell me this now? He demanded. Because you are not fracturing, she said. You are listening. A chill ran through him. He had felt it, the vibration beneath the soil, the strange clarity in moments of silence. The sense that something vast stirred just beyond sight. You are not unfit, she continued. You are receptive. The word struck him harder than any insult his father had thrown. Receptive suggested participation, not deficiency. My lineage does not serve yours, she said, her voice firm now. We contain it. We guide the merging so it does not consume everything. Without us, the pact would devour both bloodlines. The wind rose sharply, bending the cane in a circular motion around them. The hum beneath the earth intensified, resonating up through his legs and into his spine. He felt pressure behind his eyes, as though unseen hands were prying them open from within. You stand at a crossing, she said, stepping closer. You can fight it, like the others did, and break. Or you can learn to stand with it. The air thickened, charged with something electric and ancient. For a brief, terrifying instant, he felt as though the soil beneath them shifted, not physically, but in awareness. As if something vast and patient recognized his presence fully for the first time. Her hand closed around his wrist, steady and grounding. You are not a victim of this, she said. Nor am I. We are custodians of something your father barely comprehends. In that clearing, beneath the watchful moon and the restless cane, he understood that she was not merely the strongest woman on the plantation. She was the keeper of a lineage woven into the land itself, a guardian of a pact sealed long before his birth, and as the hum beneath the earth rose to meet the pounding of his heart, he felt the fragile boundary between inheritance and destiny begin to dissolve. It began subtly, in ways that could be dismissed by those desperate to maintain reason. A mule was found collapsed near the western fence at dawn, its body intact, eyes wide and glassy as though it had witnessed something unbearable. There were no wounds, no blood spilled into the dirt, yet its flesh felt oddly weightless when the stable hands tried to lift it. By noon, whispers threaded through the plantation like smoke. By evening, his father had ordered the carcass burned without ceremony. The next night, the dogs refused to leave their kennels. They crouched low, whining at corners no one else could see, teeth bared at empty air. Overseers muttered about wolves, about fever, about rot in the water. But there were no tracks beyond the ordinary impressions of boots and hooves. No sign of intrusion. Only an atmosphere that seemed to thicken after sunset, pressing down on lungs and thought alike. The sun felt it most acutely. The hum beneath the soil had grown stronger, no longer a faint vibration but a steady pulse that aligned with his own heartbeat. When he stood still in the fields, he could sense shifts in the wind before they occurred, could almost anticipate the direction of movement among the cane. It was not sight, not sound, but awareness. And with each passing day, it deepened. His father noticed. At first, the old man's reaction was irritation masked as discipline. He barked sharper orders, scrutinized the son's posture at the dinner table, questioned him with pointed, probing remarks. You look pale, he observed one evening, cutting into his meat with unnecessary force. Is the arrangement proving too much for you? The son met his gaze evenly. No. The father's eyes narrowed, searching for tremor or hesitation. Finding none seemed to unsettle him more than weakness would have. Then the livestock began to vanish. Not stolen, there were no broken gates, no cut fences, but simply gone. A pen of goats stood open one morning, empty and undisturbed, as though the animals had dissolved into the night. The overseers searched the perimeter, fanning out with rifles and lanterns, yet found no trace. Even the ground refused to betray a trail. The enslaved workers grew quieter with each occurrence. Their glances toward the cane fields lingered longer. Some began leaving small offerings near the tree line, bits of bread, scraps of cloth, whispered words carried on the wind. The son noticed his father watching these acts from the veranda, jaw clenched tight enough to tremble. Paranoia crept into the plantation house like mold spreading unseen beneath walls. His father began pacing at odd hours, boots striking hardwood floors long after midnight. The son would wake to the sound and feel the answering vibration beneath the earth, as if the land responded to the restless footsteps above it. One evening, a scream split the air. It came from the northern fields, sharp and abrupt. Men ran toward it with torches held high. They found one of the overseers on his knees in the dirt, hands clawing at his ears. His face was ashen, eyes unfocused. "It's in the ground," the man gasped. "It's moving." They searched the area thoroughly. Found nothing but disturbed soil in a widening circle around where he had collapsed. By morning, the overseer had developed a fever and raved incoherently about voices speaking beneath his feet. His father ordered him confined to the storage shed until the delirium passed. But it did not pass. The son watched as his father's composure began to fracture at the edges. The old man spent hours in the library, poring over ledgers and journals with increasing agitation. He drank more heavily, muttering to himself about cycles and correction. One night, the son stood outside the study door and heard his father whisper, "It was controlled before." It obeyed. Obeyed. As if the land had ever been a servant. The strongest enslaved woman remained outwardly calm, yet her eyes sharpened with awareness. "It is stirring fully now," she told him in the cabin, her voice steady but grave. "It has been fed for generations. But your father believes he commands it. His fear is loosening the boundaries." Thunder rolled across a clear sky that night, though no storm formed. The air vibrated with electric tension. The cane fields moved in synchronized waves despite the absence of wind, bending inward toward the center of the property as though drawn by a silent magnet. Then came the blood. A prized stallion was found at dawn near the clearing where the soil darkened unnaturally. Unlike the mule, this body bore marks, thin, branching fissures along its hide, as if something had pressed outward from within before retreating. The ground beneath it pulsed faintly when stepped upon, a sensation so subtle that only the son seemed to notice it. His father knelt beside the animal, hands shaking as he traced the cracks in its skin. "This is not how it was meant to happen," he muttered. The merging was contained. Contained. The son saw the truth then. His father had never understood the pact. He had inherited instructions without comprehension, repeating rituals as one might follow a recipe without knowing the nature of its ingredients. Now the consequences were no longer confined to a single cabin at the edge of the fields. They were spreading. At supper that evening, the father's composure shattered. "You have done something," he accused suddenly, slamming his fist against the table. The candles flickered violently, though no draught touched them. "Since this arrangement began, the land has turned against us." The son felt the hum rise beneath his ribs, answering the accusation with steady force. "Perhaps it was never yours to command," he said quietly. The word struck like a blow. His father's face drained of color. For a moment, genuine fear surfaced in his eyes, not of his son, but of the possibility that control had always been an illusion. That night, the plantation did not sleep. The cane fields hissed with continuous motion, leaves scraping together in restless chorus. Windows rattled in their frames. The confined overseer began screaming again, his voice merging with the wind until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. The son stood at the edge of the veranda and felt the ground shift beneath him, not physically breaking, but awakening. The pulse beneath the soil synchronized fully with his heartbeat now, no longer separate rhythms but one continuous current. Behind him, his father whispered frantic calculations into the darkness, flipping through ledgers as though numbers could restore order. But the land no longer responded to ink or command. It responded to fear. And as paranoia consumed the old man, tightening around his thoughts like a vice, the boundaries that had once held the pact in fragile balance began to unravel, allowing something vast and patient to stretch outward beyond the clearing, beyond the ritual cabin, beyond the narrow intentions of a man who had mistaken repetition for mastery, and in the rising chorus of wind and distant, unearthly murmurs threading through the fields, it became unmistakably clear that whatever had been awakened was no longer willing to remain contained within the limits his father had so arrogantly assumed were permanent by the time the choice stood before him. It no longer felt like a crossroads but like the narrowing of a tunnel. The plantation had become a living thing, breathing through the cane fields, murmuring beneath floorboards, pressing its awareness against his skin at all hours. Sleep offered no refuge. When he closed his eyes, he did not dream in images but in sensations, roots threading through veins, soil folding over bone, whispers rising in layered harmony from beneath the earth. They no longer startled him. They invited him. His father had retreated into obsession. The once commanding figure now haunted the halls with ink-stained fingers and trembling lips, clutching ledgers as though they were sacred scripture. He spoke of restoring order, of tightening ritual constraints, of correcting whatever deviation had occurred in this generation's pairing. But his voice carried a hollow edge. He was a man arguing with a tide. The strongest enslaved woman watched all of it with a stillness that felt almost sorrowful. "It is reaching its fullness," she told him one evening as they stood at the edge of the dark clearing. The air pulsed visibly now, faint distortions shimmering above the soil like heat rising from stone. "It will not wait much longer." He understood what she meant. The merging that had fractured the minds of his predecessors had not fractured his. It had rooted itself. The whispers beneath the land no longer sounded foreign. They sounded like memory. He could sense where the soil was thickest with what had been given over generations. He could feel the threads connecting his blood to something vast and subterranean. It was intoxicating. But it was also consuming. Livestock deaths had ceased, not because the force had weakened, but because it no longer fed blindly. The disturbances had grown precise. Fences collapsed only where his father stood inspecting them. Windows shattered only in rooms where the old man paced. The confined overseer had fallen silent altogether, found one morning staring vacantly at the wall, lips moving in soundless conversation with something unseen. "It is aligning with you," she said softly. "You are the first who has not resisted." He looked at his hands in the moonlight. The veins along his wrists seemed darker, more defined. When he pressed his palm to the earth, warmth rose to meet him. Not imagined. Not metaphor. Real. "And if I accept it fully?" he asked. Her gaze did not waver. "Then the pact transforms. It ceases to be hunger and becomes dominion." Dominion. The word carried weight. For generations, his family had believed themselves masters of this land. But true dominion had never been theirs. It had been borrowed, negotiated through blood and ignorance. If he embraced what stirred within him, the balance would shift irrevocably. The land would no longer require ritual correction. It would act through him. "And my father?" he asked. "The old structure will fall," she replied. "It must." The answer settled heavily in his chest. To embrace the darkness meant ending the lineage as it had existed, ending his father's obsession with breeding strength through cruelty. It meant surrendering whatever remained of his humanity to something older than morality. But to destroy the legacy, to sever the pact entirely, would demand a different sacrifice. The land had been fed for generations. To starve it suddenly could unleash devastation uncontrolled. Crops would rot. Wells would sour. The force bound beneath the soil might tear outward violently rather than recede. The night his father confronted him, the sky churned with silent lightning. "You will submit to correction," the old man demanded, cornering him in the study. Candles flared and guttered wildly between them. "I will not allow centuries of careful cultivation to collapse because of your weakness." Weakness. The word no longer stung. It sounded small. "You never controlled it," he said quietly. His father's hand shook as he reached for the ledger on the desk. "I preserved it. I ensured prosperity." "You fed it," he replied. The room trembled. Books slid from shelves without touch. The floorboards beneath them pulsed in visible rhythm. For the first time, naked terror overtook his father's face. "You would choose it over your own blood," the old man whispered. he felt the truth rise within him, heavy and undeniable. The blood was not separate from it. It never had been. Outside, the cane fields bent inward toward the house, forming a slow, spiraling pattern visible even in the dark. The hum beneath the earth reached a crescendo that vibrated through glass and bone alike. He could feel it waiting, not impatiently, but expectantly. The strongest enslaved woman appeared in the doorway, her presence steady amid the chaos. "It is time," she said. "Time for what?" "For ascension. For annihilation. For inheritance of a different kind." He stepped forward, away from the desk, away from the brittle structure of ledgers and calculations. As he did, the tremors intensified, then steadied. The air thickened around him but felt breathable, natural. The whispers resolved into clarity, not words exactly, but intention. His father collapsed to his knees, clutching at the floor as if trying to anchor himself to authority that no longer recognized him. "Stop this," he rasped. "You don't understand what you're unleashing." He understood perfectly. He could end it here, drive a blade into the soil of the clearing, break the ritual ground, let the backlash consume them all in one violent severing. Or he could step fully into alignment and reshape the pact from within, ending the cycle of forced pairings and engineered correction by becoming the bridge willingly. The land did not demand cruelty. That had been his father's interpretation. What it demanded was continuity. He closed his eyes and pressed both hands to the floorboards. Warmth surged upward, not scorching but enveloping. The tremors ceased instantly, replaced by profound stillness. Outside, the spiraling cane froze mid-motion. The silence that followed was not emptiness but suspension. When he opened his eyes, the air felt different, clearer, sharper. The pulse beneath the earth now matched him entirely. Not hunger. Not chaos. Balance. Behind him, his father's breath came shallow and uneven. The old order had cracked beyond repair. He had chosen not destruction, but transformation. The legacy that had bound generations in fear and madness no longer required secrecy or ritual breeding. It lived in him consciously now, guided rather than resisted. The strongest enslaved woman met his gaze across the room, and for the first time, something like relief flickered in her eyes. Outside, the cane fields slowly straightened, their restless whisper quieted to a low, harmonious murmur, and beneath the plantation, deep within the dark soil layered with centuries of blood and memory, the ancient current settled into a new rhythm that no longer fed on desperation but flowed through a willing vessel who understood that inheritance was not a chain to be dragged or shattered, but a force to be mastered before it mastered him.